So to summarize the lesson, we're going to recap behaviorist theories of learning, associative learning, classical and operant conditioning, and cognitive theories of learning, for example, latent learning, and the overlaps between cognitive and behaviorist theories of learning. Okay, so just to take a moment now to think about the summary. So obviously you're not expected to memorize all the learning. It's not just about memorizing facts, it's becoming familiar with the subject. So the idea is to know where to look things up, understand explanations when you do look things up, and always feel free to ask questions in lesson. That's okay. So we're going to focus on behavior theories of learning, which falls into associative learning, classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and cognitive theories of learning, and how that overlaps between behavioral and cognitive theories of learning. So let's look at behaviorist theories of learning to begin with. So we'll begin with classical conditioning. Pavlov laid the foundations of behaviorism, and he was interested in salivation in dogs in response to being fed. So he paired associations between the sound of a bell and the anticipation of food by dogs. He termed this learning by association, classical conditioning. Okay. So one thing to think about is behaviorists like Pavlov were interested in measuring observable behaviors. So behaviorism, if you think behaviorism, think the things we do. Think cognitivism, things we think. Cognitive behaviorism, things we think and do. So behaviorists like Pavlov were interested in observable, measurable behaviors. Cognitive is one that if what we do, or what we think, cognitive, what we think may influence behavior. So we're interested in cognitive processes in learning. Perhaps classical conditioning is not the full story of learning, but just part of it, one thing to think about. So operant conditioning was based on the work of Skinner, B.F. Skinner, and he emphasized the role of rewards and punishment, cause-effect influencing whether or not a behavior would be repeated. So that was based on the work of Thorndike, 1898. So Skinner's box, as it became known, animals placed in the box with a lever to press. So, for example, the pigeon experiments in 1948 observed pigeons' behavior when they were roaming around the box and being fed at regular intervals. He found that when a bird, particular movements coincided with food arriving, the bird interpreted that movement as having caused the arrival of food. So the birds then began to do that particular movement more often and anticipated the arrival of food. The food was a positive reward for birds as they associated with the particular movement behavior. So Skinner called that operant conditioning. Okay, so maybe a moment to think about that. Operant conditioning. And there are plenty of videos out there if you get an opportunity to sort of check them out. You can sort of Google Skinner's operant conditioning, rewards and punishment. So the really important points here. So classical and operant conditioning overlaps. So classical and operant conditioning both belong to behaviorist school of thought, learning by association. There are obviously some overlaps, and take a moment to think about what you think the overlaps are. What do you think that some of the overlaps are? So classical, the idea is the organism associates the events, involuntary and automatic response, acquisition, associating events. NS is paired with US, becomes CS, classical conditioning. Extinction, for example. So the CR decreases when the CS is repeated, presents alone. Spontaneous recovery, the reappearance after a test period of an extinguished CR. Generalization, the tendency to respond to stimuli rather to the CS, and the learned ability to distinguish between a CS and the other stimuli that do not signal a US. So operant conditioning The main ideas are the organism associates the behavior and resulting events. Voluntary response operates on the environment. The acquisition associating response with a consequence, reinforcer, punisher. Extinction, response decreases when reinforcement stops. Spontaneous recovery, the appearance after a rest period of an extinguished response. Generalization, organism's response to similar stimuli is reinforced. Discrimination, organism learns that certain responses, not others, will be reinforced. So both forms of associative learning involve acquisition, extinction, spontaneous recovery, generalization, and discrimination, and influenced by biology and cognitive processes. So both are influenced by biology and cognitive processes. The schedule of reinforcement in operant conditioning. So let's sort of take a moment to think. The fixed and the variable. So the reinforcement given after an action completed a fixed amount of times, and the variable is reinforcement given after action completed a varying amount of times. The interval reinforcement given, so the fixed interval reinforcement given after a fixed period of time if the action is completed. The variable interval reinforcement given after varying periods of time if action is completed. So cognitive theories, now we'll look at cognitive theories of learning. So we'll explore latent learning. Latent learning is sometimes called incidental learning and occurs without any obvious reward or punishment at time, but which manifests when there is a suitable motivational circumstances. So Tolman and Honzig, 1930, and Tolman, 1948, demonstrated a cognitive map, an internal representation of a physical space that formed from large numbers and environmental cues. So they used mazes of rats to find their way around 3 different experimental conditions. So one group of rats got a reward of food when they reached the end of the maze for 17 days. The second group of rats got no food reward when they reached the end of the maze on days 1 to 10. Got a food reward on days 11 to 17. The third group of rats did not get any food reward for reaching the end of the maze. Okay, now take a moment to think about that for a moment, and think. Okay, well, you got the rewarded learned the maze, no reward, and the results were the rewarded had learned the maze. The no reward improved slightly. Getting out was a small reward, and delayed reward, 11 to 17 days, caught up with the rewarded group, and they did even better. So that's quite interesting that the delayed reward group, that got the 11 to 17 days, caught up to the rewarded group and ended up doing even better. So it's quite interesting, really. And think about that for a moment comparatively to operant conditioning. Think about that, the rewarded group operant conditioning, for example, and you got the delayed reward. And think about how they would catch up and do even better. So I want you to think about for a moment, just summarize, take some moment, and think about what are the differences, what are the similarities and main differences do you think between classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and latent learning? So perhaps you can sort of draw a couple of tables, 3 different tables, and write down what you think are the similarities and differences, and write a paragraph on what you think is the strength and weakness. The strength and weakness of classical conditioning, the strength and weakness of operant conditioning, the strength and weakness of latent learning. And you start to identify some overlaps between behaviorist and cognitive theories. So a paradigm is a theoretical stance that a psychological researcher takes, an approach to understanding psychological phenomena. A paradigm consists of basic assumptions, the ways of thinking and methods of study that are commonly accepted by members of a group. Behaviorist paradigm, learning based on stimulus response, for example, the black box of the mind cannot be studied. Cognitive paradigm, learning based on the learner being an information processor, and the learning is not just due to external stimuli, but is the result of mental processes. The black box of the mind can be studied. So differences between behaviorist and cognitive theories. So like behavioral model, you've got you only study observable behavior, external behavior. So stimulus in the environment, the black box can't be studied. Response behavior. In a cognitive model, Psych can scientifically study internal behavior. So the input in the environment, the mediational process, the mental event, and the output behavior. So I suppose the overlaps between behaviorist and cognitive theories, the aim to improving teaching and learning processes, both take into account previous knowledge in determining what should be taught, and a combination of both are still used, obviously, in today's sort of classrooms. Although some of the main differences are in cognitive psychology, psychologists, learning is an internal brain process. You can't observe directly the disequilibrium exists, changing of knowledge, learning is transferable. Teachers should grade students in figuring out concepts out by themselves, a rearrangement of existing knowledge. Whereas in behaviorism, believe that behavior is shaped and strengthened for reinforcement, view learning as a result of external stimuli, easily measured, looks at stimulus and learner's response. Behavior is shaped and strengthened through drill and practice to achieve the desired behavior. Too much focus on repeating steps without hardly knowing what's going on, and learning is sequential and hierarchical. So I want you to summarize the differences that you think between behaviorist approaches and cognitive approaches and latent learning approaches. So take a moment now and summarize what you think is the difference between behaviorist approaches, cognitive approaches, and latent learning approaches. Okay. So more on latent learning. So reflections on what we've learned so far. So I just want to touch base. Operant and classical conditioning are considered behavioral approaches. Behaviorists focus on observed behavior, stimulus response, and do not generally concern themselves with the black box of the mind, internal processes that occur. They may make inferences about them, associations when made, when learning is made, anticipations of the rewards, avoidance, punishment. Latent learning is considered a cognitive approach. Latent learning is considered a cognitive approach. Cognitive focus on the gap between stimulus and response, the black box of the mind, and between environmental stimuli and behavior that is observed. So the gap between stimulus and response involves mental process like choice, for example, and is an information processing approach. So when you think about the Tolman and Honzig's theory of latent learning, so condition one, food, where the rats successfully found the target, the food box, the rats were rewarded with food. So that was reinforced. Condition two, no food. The rats ran successfully around the maze, the food box, the rats were not rewarded with the food, not reinforced, or simply removed from the maze. Condition three, food after day 11. So condition three, food after day 11. During days 1 to 10, the rats in the group treated like those in day 2, where no reward was given, no reinforcement. And during days 11 to 17, the rats in this group were rewarded with food. When they reached the target, as with the rats in group 1, reinforced. So the results, group 1, the performance of the rats improved steadily with each food reward. Group 2, performance of the rats improved, but very slowly, still eventually learned without a food reward. Group 3, the performance of these rats was similar to Group 2 from days 1 to 11, but these rats then outperformed Group 1 from day 13 onwards, which is really interesting. So the conclusion is the Group 3 rats had a hidden store of latent knowledge that led to a cognitive map, a black box of knowledge and learning that occurred. Therefore, there was more to it than the behaviorist approaches, which is pretty interesting. So let's sort of have some time to think about it. A bit of critical thinking, really, and critical thinking, latent learning. Anthropomorphism is the tendency to use results from animal studies to extrapolate to humans. What do you think of this? So what do you think of sort of using animal studies to extrapolate to humans? So I'll just search in some information and critiques of the research studies, anthropomorphic, and bullet the pros and cons of that. So hint, can you think of any real life uses that combine behaviorist, cognitive, and latent learning approaches in the lives of human beings that maybe stem from these early pieces of research? So take the time to think about that. Can you think of any examples that combine behaviorist, cognitive, and latent learning approaches in the lives of human beings that may have been stemmed from these early pieces of research. Okay. So just some time to reflect as we sort of draw to a close of this lesson summary. I want you to think about times when you've learned by classical condition. Write one time that you've learned through classical condition. Write a time where you learned through operant condition. And I want you to write a time down that you learned from latent condition when you can, whenever you can, and take some time to think about it if you can. Okay. Thank you.